I'll never forget the night I spent in St. Mary's Hospital. It was supposed to be a routine observation, just a precaution after a minor car accident. The doctor said I was fine, but they wanted to keep me overnight to monitor for any delayed symptoms. I didn't argue. I was sore, shaken up, and honestly, I didn't mind the idea of a quiet night in a sterile, safe place. But what happened that night was anything but safe. It started around 2 a.m. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The hospital was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. My roommate, an elderly woman named Mrs. Grady, had been asleep for hours, her soft snores the only sound in the room. I was just about to drift off when I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was the wind. My room was on the 3rd floor, so it couldn't be a person, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked toward the window. The blinds were closed, but I could see shadows moving behind them. Long, thin shadows that didn't make sense. There were no trees outside my window, just the brick wall of the adjacent building. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the blinds began to move. Not like they were being blown by the wind, but like someone or something was pulling them apart. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the blinds opened just enough to reveal the window. There was nothing there, just the dark glass reflecting the dim light from the hallway. I let out a shaky laugh, telling myself it was just my imagination, but then I saw it. A face. Pressed against the glass, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, too wide, too many teeth. I screamed. The face disappeared instantly, and the blinds snapped back into place. Mrs. Grady woke up, groggy and confused, asking what was wrong. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the window, my hand shaking. She frowned, squinting at me like I was crazy, and then lay back down, muttering something about kids these days. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my eyes glued to the window, waiting for the face to return. But it didn't. Instead, the sounds started. Soft at first, a faint scratching on the door like nails dragging across the wood. Then came the whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they were coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, even the air around me. They were low, guttural, and filled with a malice that made my skin crawl. I pressed the call button for the nurse, my finger jabbing at it frantically. When she finally arrived, I was in tears, babbling about the face and the whispers. She gave me a sympathetic smile and said, "It's just the medication, honey. You're fine." But I wasn't fine. I knew what I saw, what I heard. The nurse left, and the room fell silent again. I thought maybe it was over, but then the temperature dropped. It was like someone had opened a freezer door. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see frost forming on the window. Mrs. Grady's snores stopped abruptly, and I turned to look at her. She was sitting up in bed, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cold and flat. "They don't like it when people stay too long." Before I could respond, she lay back down and started snoring again, as if nothing had happened. I was too terrified to move. The whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent. And then I saw them. Shadows. Moving across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They didn't belong to anything. No objects, no people. They were just there, writhing and twisting like living things. I closed my eyes, praying for it to stop. When I opened them again, the room was normal. The shadows were gone, the temperature was back to normal, and Mrs. Grady was still asleep. I thought maybe I had imagined it all, until I looked at the window. Written in the frost on the glass were 2 words, "Get out!" I didn't wait for morning. I ripped out my IV, grabbed my things, and ran. The hallway was empty, the nurse's station deserted. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. As I reached the elevator, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I didn't look back. I slammed the elevator button, my heart racing, and when the doors finally opened, I practically fell inside. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I bolted through the lobby and out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I called a friend to pick me up, and I never went back to St. Mary's. Years later, I found out the hospital had been built on the site of an old asylum, a place where patients were subjected to horrific experiments, where many died in agony, Some say their spirits never left. I believe it. Because that night, I wasn't alone in that room. And whatever was there with me, it didn't want me to stay.
Story number 2.
It was the summer of 1998 when I took a job as a night security guard at the old Millwood Asylum. The place had been abandoned for decades, but the owners were trying to sell the property, and they needed someone to keep an eye on it. The pay was good, and the job seemed easy enough. Just walk the halls every couple of hours, make sure no one broke in. I figured it would be a quiet way to earn some extra cash. I was wrong. The first night was uneventful. The building was creepy, sure, with its peeling wallpaper, broken windows, and the faint smell of mildew that seemed to cling to everything. But nothing happened. I did my rounds, checked the locks, and spent the rest of the night reading a book in the security office. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was convinced the job would be a breeze. The second night was different. It started around 2 a.m. I was making my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from one of the patient rooms on the second floor. I froze, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound was unmistakable. Tap, 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 like someone was knocking on wood. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. I had to check it out. My footsteps echoed loudly as I climbed the stairs, the tapping growing louder with each step. When I reached the second floor, I followed the sound to room 217. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping was coming from inside. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, just like all the others. A rusted bed frame, a broken chair, and a cracked mirror on the wall. But the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the mirror. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, and shone the light directly at the glass. That's when I saw it. A hand. Pressed against the other side of the mirror. It was pale and skeletal, the fingers tapping lightly on the surface. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. When I looked again, the hand was gone. I didn't finish my rounds that night. I ran back to the security office and locked the door, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. The next night, I tried to convince myself it wouldn't happen again. But as soon as the clock struck 2 a.m., the tapping started. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I stayed in the office trying to ignore it, but the sound was relentless. Tap, tap, tap. It was like it was calling to me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and went back to room 217. The door was closed this time, but the tapping was still coming from inside. I pushed the door open, my hand trembling, and shone the light at the mirror. The hand was there again, but this time it wasn't just tapping. It was scratching. Long, jagged lines were appearing on the glass, as if the hand was trying to claw its way through. I backed away, my heart pounding, and the scratching stopped. The room fell silent. I was about to leave when I heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper coming from the mirror. "Let me out." I didn't wait to hear more. I ran back to the office and called my boss, telling him I quit. He tried to convince me to stay, even offered me more money, but I refused. No amount of money was worth that. Years later, I found out the history of Millwood Asylum. It had been a place of unspeakable horrors, experiments, torture, and countless deaths. The patients who died there were never given proper burials. Their bodies were sealed in the walls, their spirits trapped. Some say the mirrors were used to communicate with the other side, to keep the patients' souls contained. But sometimes they find a way to reach out. I don't know what was in that mirror, but I do know this. It wasn't human, and it wanted out.
Story number 3.
It was the fall of 2005 when I moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town. The place was a steal. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a price tag that seemed too good to be true. The real estate agent told me the previous owners had left in a hurry, but she didn't say why. I didn't ask. I was too excited about finally owning my own home, but that excitement didn't last long. The first week was fine. The house was everything I'd hoped for, spacious, charming, and full of character. But by the second week, I started noticing things, little things at first. Doors would creak open on their own. The temperature would drop suddenly, even though the heat was on. And then there were the footsteps, soft, shuffling footsteps that seemed to come from the attic. I told myself it was just the house settling or maybe an animal that had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it was something else. One night I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard it, a faint melodic humming coming from the hallway. It was a woman's voice, soft and soothing, but there was something off about it, something wrong. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened. The humming grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right outside my door. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept to the door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. The hallway was empty, but the humming didn't stop. It was coming from the attic. I followed the sound, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, until I reached the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The door at the top was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from the crack. I climbed the stairs slowly, my grip tightening on the bat. When I reached the top, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with old, decaying boxes. But what caught my attention was the rocking chair in the center of the room. It was an old, wooden rocking chair, the kind you'd see in a grandmother's house, and it was moving back and forth, as if someone was sitting in it. But the chair was empty. The humming was coming from it. I took a step closer, my breath shallow, and the chair stopped moving. The humming stopped too, and the room fell silent. I was about to leave when I heard a voice, a soft, whispery voice that seemed to come from all around me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The light bulb flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure sitting in the rocking chair, a woman in a long white dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. But when the light steadied, the chair was empty again. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, the lights on, the baseball bat in my lap. The next morning, I called a friend who was into paranormal investigations. He came over that afternoon with a bunch of equipment, EMF meters, digital recorders, the works. We spent hours going through the house, but we didn't find anything unusual until we reached the attic. As soon as we stepped inside, the EMF meter started going crazy. The needle was jumping all over the place, and the temperature dropped suddenly. My friend set up a digital recorder on the floor and asked if anyone was there. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a whisper. "Leave." My friend's eyes widened, and he asked another question. "Who are you?" The response was clearer this time, the voice cold and angry. "Mine." We didn't stay long after that. My friend packed up his equipment and told me he'd never seen anything like it. He suggested I call a priest, but I didn't. I didn't want to believe it was real. But the activity only got worse. Doors would slam shut on their own. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. And the humming, it was constant, always coming from the attic. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like hers. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to the attic, determined to confront whatever was there. The rocking chair was moving again, and the humming was louder than ever. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and shouted, "What do you want?" The chair stopped moving, and the humming stopped. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, the light bulb began to flicker. I saw her again, the woman in the white dress. She was sitting in the rocking chair, her hollow eyes staring right at me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. And then she was gone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran out of the attic, packed a bag, and left the house. I never went back. I couldn't. The house was sold a few months later, and I heard the new owners moved out after just a week. I don't know what happened to them, but I do know this. The house wasn't empty, and whatever was there, it didn't want to share.
Story number 4.
It was the winter of 2012 when I took a job as a caretaker at the old Blackwood estate. The place was massive, a sprawling mansion tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by snow-covered trees and silence. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Blackwood, had passed away a few months earlier, and his family needed someone to look after the property until it could be sold. The job came with a generous salary and free room and board. It seemed like a dream come true, but dreams have a way of turning into nightmares. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, checking the locks, and exploring the mansion. It was a beautiful place full of antique furniture, oil paintings, and ornate chandeliers, but there was something off about it. Something cold. No matter how high I turned up the heat, the air always felt icy, and the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. The first strange thing happened on my fourth night. I was in the library, reading by the fire, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking coming from the walls. It was soft at first, almost like a heartbeat, but it grew louder and more insistent. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall, trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when I felt it, a vibration, like something was moving inside the walls. I told myself it was just the pipes or the wind. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking didn't stop. It followed me through the house, always just out of reach, always just behind the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The sound was everywhere, echoing in my ears, even when I covered them. The next night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar and started prying at the walls, looking for the source of the knocking. It didn't take long to find it. Behind a loose panel in the basement, I discovered a hidden room. It was small and windowless, with a single chair in the center and chains hanging from the walls. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was stained with something dark and dried. I didn't stay long. I ran back upstairs, my heart pounding, and locked the basement door. I told myself it was just an old storage room, something left over from a darker time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The knocking stopped after that, but other things started happening. Objects would move on their own, a chair sliding across the floor, a book falling from a shelf. I would hear whispers in the hallways, low and guttural, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. And then there were the shadows. They seemed to have a life of their own, twisting and writhing in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. One night, I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I heard it, a child's laughter, high and clear, coming from the dining room. I froze, my knife hovering over the cutting board, and listened. The laughter grew louder, more manic, until it was almost deafening. I dropped the knife and ran to the dining room, but it was empty. The laughter stopped as soon as I stepped inside. I was about to leave when I saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a child, a little girl in a tattered dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes black and hollow. She was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made your blood run cold. I backed away, my heart pounding, and the girl disappeared. But the laughter didn't stop. It followed me through the house, always just behind me, always just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, the lights on, a baseball bat in my lap. The next morning, I called the family who owned the estate and told them I was quitting. They tried to convince me to stay, even offered me more money, but I refused. No amount of money was worth that. Before I left, I did some research on the Blackwood estate. What I found made my blood run cold. The mansion had a dark history, a history of disappearances of children who had gone missing and were never found. Some said the house was cursed, that it was built on land that was sacred to the Native Americans who had once lived there. Others said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died within its walls. I don't know what was in that house, but I do know this. It wasn't empty. And whatever was there, it didn't want me to leave.